And actually, I mean, you have introduced one scale, and there is also the question of microdosimetry. So there is also field increases on an even lower scale that are. There is some little bit of research on endoplasmatic reticuli and on plasmoids, but yeah, there's a lot more on the lower scales to be looked into. So I will start with an apology. I'm here just as a very poor surrogate for the two experts that were meant to be here, which is Miles Capstick and Niels. Now Miles is traveling elsewhere, and Niels is out of order because of a busted shoulder. So I will be talking about things that I know fairly little about, but I have gone through a tough school last week with them trying to get me to know their point of view. So let's dive right into that. So there's a smart world, so-called. There's all types of exposures that we get from different sources at the same time that have a completely different characterization, some of them new and poorly understood. And the objective is that, well, I can maybe start with this picture. So what a lot has been done about and what compliance is, it tests a certain quantity in order that you satisfy the regulatory concerns. But when you want to do real risk evaluation, when you want to know the exposure in your experiment, when you want to know how the different tissues are affected, when you want to do epidemiology, where you want to relate it to certain effects, there is a need to mimic the real life exposure. And all of this talk here is going to be about that. It's going to be about how you can characterize the type of external environment that you are exposed to, how you can explore the energy deposition in the human, how you can link that then to the question of what type of exposure you get, and also how you can assess various means of reducing that exposure. And so for that we need to create exposure matrices for the past and also for epidemiological study, where we want to know what kind of exposure have people seen and what are the most relevant exposure parameters that should be measured in the future from now on, so that we have a better database, because frankly the one for the past is pretty poor. And then how can we connect that to the experimental evidence that we have about different effects, and particularly about brain. I'll talk a bit more here. Where are the gaps, and provide the basis for exposure evaluation and also requirements. And there are these three levels. There's the question of what are people exposed to. There's the question of what kind of power deposition, what type of fields does that induce in the body. And then there's the question of biology and risk evaluation. And I'll particularly talk about some new EU studies that were started in the last years that will try to close the gap also to that last one. And we will be using repeatedly these type of anatomical models that I've already talked about. And this is a bit of a starting point. That was an attempt to put together the type of exposure that people see in an environment. And what you will see is the highest type of exposure that we get is exposure from things close to the head, because of the simple proximity effects. We will later on see that things like Weyland cordless phones and dead cordless phones are in similar magnitude. What you also see is that base stations and so on, they are typically much lower, but what you also see is that newer and clever methodology have a higher variability, because they are more capable of reacting to the current needs and requirements. And so one of the first things that was done were these type of SAR measurements for compliance testing. So these are the type of standardized measurements that every device has to go through, and it uses a standardized type of head, which is meant to provide a conservative assessment, which it doesn't always do, but the idea behind this is that it should be conservative, it should correspond to the worst case that you can get. And then there is the old question, what happens when you have your hand next to the phone? Some of you might remember the mobile phone of the Apple, when they had these antennas that could be short-circuited when you put the finger in the right place. So the hand plays a major role, and these things are then measured. Another measurement that was done is the over-the-air measurement, where you look at the efficiency of the phone. The logic being that when your phone is well capable of radiating to the base station, it needs less power because it is efficiently radiating there. When you have obstacles, when you have a hand, you expect the efficiency to decrease, which means the power goes up and your exposure of the head is likely to increase. So from these type of compliance measurements, what you see is that there is an effect of the presence of the hand. In some cases, that is quite a dramatic decrease. In other cases, it's an increase of exposure as a result of the presence of the hand. So the hand has a non-negligible important impact. And also when you look to the over-the-air exposure, you see that already bringing the head to the vicinity of the phone will reduce its efficacy because some energy is deposited and lost in the head. And when you bring the hand in, it goes down even further. So that's more evidence that the presence of the hand of the person phoning is an important presence to be detected. When you look at cordless phones, what we see is these type of magnitudes of levels, rather a tendency of being a bit lower than the other phones, not much, but they have typically no power control. At least the old systems had a constant high level of exposure, whereas the other ones were capable of down-regulating when you had a good connection. The presence of secondary Wi-Fi transmitter had little interference effect, so that didn't lead to a higher exposure. Now we have near and far field exposure. To get an idea about far field exposure, which is relevant when you're talking about things like base station antennas where you are not right next to them, can be mimicked by type of plane wave exposure. And we were particularly interested to do that because we wanted to see how different organs are then exposed as a result of that. So we exposed it from all different sides and with different polarization, and we looked at the different types of tissue. I don't want you to take much out of that slide rather than the fact that you can look at the different tissues. It's going to get more interesting when we look later on at the brain. So the philosophy is that when you have compliance testing approaches, they do measurements. There are various types of measurements that you can do. You can do area scans and zoom scans. All of them are defined by standards. Then you get an idea of what the field is all over the place in your phantom. So that's still the bowling ball, as I think Deborah calls it. But what we then try to do via a lot of modeling is to, first of all, we project it into that in anatomy. So we put into this where the different regions would be in the SAM model. We use for that, for example, Talarach atlases, which are multi-level atlases of brain regions. And then we did find transformation factors between the type of exposure that you get in this homogeneous factor and what you would get if you had considered the complexity of the human head. And we can do that for different models and different forms of exposure, and we learn that depending on the frequency, so for example, when you go to higher frequency, the variability is much bigger. So this is because the absorption is going to be more localized, so it will depend much more on how your phone is, and therefore you will have to include a much higher safety margin when you are trying to map a measurement in a homogeneous phantom to a non-homogeneous, because the variability will be much larger. On the other side, at lower frequency, the variability will decrease. Now, this is another research project that is the Gridmaster developed for MobiKits, which we'll see again in later points in the presentation. The idea here was to kind of find a statistical tool where you can characterize where the exposure is and later on also relate that to observations from epidemiology. So Joe Villar is one of the main people involved in this project. And they looked at different sources and they created this type of grids where they looked at various ways of knowing what your exposure is, including, again, modeling. And then you tell which areas get a certain type of exposure. But other people look at tumors and look at where they can find tumor lesions and put those ones in the grid. The idea is that you then search for correlation between the location of highest exposure or tissue highest exposure with location of tumors. To the best of my knowledge, they haven't found any strong correlations yet, but this is also still an ongoing project. Now this is a comparison between different user groups, so the heavy and the light users. And what you see is that when you go over the data that we got from different sources, including sources where people have gone into the field and measured realistic exposure, you see that there is a bit of a difference in these type of exposure sources, which are again mobile phones, so not surprisingly the heavy users have more exposure there. And it looks like it's a small difference, but this is a dB scale, and some of these are correspond to about 1 order of magnitude difference. And again, what we see is the other sources, the one not close to head, are much lower, but some of these here, it's VLAN, if I'm not mistaken, can have a very large variability and can reach similar levels as what you see with the sources near the head. Now, typically people look at energy, but there is much more that is important. There is the question of modulation, signal characteristics, duty cycles, peak exposure versus average exposure. So this is just a little map that shows the evolution of technology. These are the old GSM phones, the frequency band that are occupied. This is UMTS, where the frequency band is already much wider. This is Wi-Fi, which makes use of a huge frequency band compared to that. And there is the dynamics. So there is the fact that you don't use, so this is just duty cycles in all GSM. This one here has already more complexity. And the GSM phones, when you switch on first, there is a relatively high. Then it finds out that the quality is good enough so it can reduce the power. And then it occasionally goes up again. The increase can be related to speech, so to the modulation of the signal. It can also be related, as we'll see later on, to handover between different towers. When you look to 3G, we have a much more dynamic signal, and we also have a much more active regulation of the intensity. So these phones do much more frequently fine-grained control of the power levels, which means that we are confronted when we do dosimetry with even more degrees of freedom, even less knowledge of what an actual exposure has been, which we can then later on correlate to epidemiology. So that's a problem that will only grow. When you look at newer protocols, you have these beacon bursts, which are meant to establish contact with base station, with the point of to which you talk to, but then you have the data, and depending on how you talk and on what you transmit as a signal, that can be very variable and unpredictable. So here as well, there is this difficulty. And we see when we compare different technologies, there can be a high variability of which frequency bands in the end are the most prominent ones present, which is a nightmare for epidemiologists. So in summary, for Wi-Fi is ubiquitous. It's highly adaptive. You see here, for example, how this is a waterfall display of communication. So there are some things like beacons that continued all the time, and somebody was transmitting some big data block, and then there is some talk, and that gets allocated between different frequencies and different times, dynamically changing the bandwidth of the frequency that is used. So Wi-Fi is a technology that is rapidly evolving. There is no typical Wi-Fi. The power can be important in a room, 100 milliwatts can occur, and the technology is changing all the time. With regard to exposure, then there are different levels of exposure systems. You can expose everything from cell culture over animals to humans. And the importance is that you have a well-characterized exposure system where you can later on say what you actually applied with high knowledge, because otherwise this will corrupt the data that you have. With regards to daily life exposure, so the problem is that you have devices all over the frequency band, but sometimes they can have a relatively low signal. You have a sensitivity issue when measuring these things. It's rapidly changing. It depends on the usage, on how much people phone, how much they do different things like watching television, light bulbs, the new kinds of light bulbs, wireless power transfer. There are various sources. And some things, it also very much depends on where the source is localized relative to your body, as we have seen already in different talks here. So the typical type of exposure assessment is that you look for places in the room which have a very high overall power deposition without yet distinguishing the frequencies, and then you put different forms of exposure measurement there that might then resolve the frequencies. You can also put dosimeters, which also distinguish causally the different frequencies, and you can use that also to get personalized information about the exposure over the day. So these are, for example, methodologies for measurements in nursery or in schools, where you put one probe in the center, one at the location of the maximum, one in front of the window where you might get exposure from the outside, and you characterize that. And what you find is that when you look at this exposure, and if we exclude the range, when you get really close to the device, if you look at a certain reasonable distance, you still have, and this is a baby monitor up here, just to say that, then you get magnitude ranges which are similar to what people are exposed to when they're close to a cell tower, just to give you an idea of the strength of these fields. Inside the room, this is split now by the different technologies, DECT, Wi-Fi, UMTS, other bands, television, radio. These are over the day. What you see here is there's not much of a yes?
With a voltage, electric field voltage, it's what you absorb is the square of the thing. So that having this kind of plot basically doesn't tell you much of anything in terms of a human being's absorption.
Yeah, and that's why this thing is not much higher than that, exactly because of what you're saying. Because in the end, it's the sum of the squares.
But your units are volts per meter.
Yeah, so you have a sum of the square of which you take the square root. Exactly. And that's why you end up with something which is heavily dominated by that one. I need to hurry with regard to time. Maybe we do the questions after the talk.
Yeah,
but I agree with your statements, very much so. So there have also been developed applications such as MobiSense. That's a project where they developed an app that people can install on their phone, which measures the number of calls, the duration, how much data is transmitted, which protocols are used. Of course, Israel will always have a special position in our heart, with the longest call times and the largest number of calls. At the time of that one, yes. That doesn't even yet look at the question of data. With regard to data, actually, it's also high, but some Asian countries are beating Israel, sorry. Then different communication systems, variability over countries, that is very much outdated. You can't trust these results anymore. Things have changed too much in these years. We have also driven this type of mankins around and measured usage, compared urban to rural area. Also that is probably outdated by now. UMTS was typically able to have a lower exposure overall, but it would have high peaks also, but overall averaged it's lower. There are changes between rural and urban area. In urban area you have more cell tower, better communication, you can down-regulate power. In rural, that's more of a problem. Again, we see the impact of the hands, and we find that the hands will typically worsen the situation, but not always. In some cases, it helps. I think I've said most of the rest here. Then, when you have this type of simultaneous exposure to different frequencies, with regard to thermal effects, what you do is you just sum the energy up. With regard to other effects, that's not a good idea. People sum what is at the same time over the frequency spectrum, that is called integrative, and over time that's called cumulative exposure. And there are a range of assumptions that go into that about the way how you combine it, and that's not necessarily true in all forms of exposure, but I don't have time to go into that anymore. What is important is that you have an accumulation of uncertainty. You have already uncertainty about what the type of exposure is, then you have uncertainty about what this elicits as energy deposition or as fields in the body, and then you have uncertainty about what that induces. So this increasingly sums up. And this is about some recently started projects, the MobiKids project, which is trying to look at the question of children exposure. So they start from the idea that there are some benefits, but what are the potential risks? With knowing that we are dealing with developing tissue with vulnerable children, and particularly also with regard to brain tumor. So they have many more years ahead. They have greater quantity of use than we used to have as children. I got my first mobile phone 6 years back, and and they might be more vulnerable. And this is just some of the data that I picked from there, showing how the average SAR in children is higher due to different reasons: anatomy, skull thickness, properties of the tissues, fluids, contents. Then two more European projects, Geronimo, that's trying to close the gap mostly between the epidemiology and the exposure side. So they have the exposure assessments, they have the biological assessment, and they have the epidemiological also with regard to different type of risks, including cancer, but also including development endpoints, and they're trying to integrate that data. So they're trying to put together the different parts that you have seen in this presentation that are at the moment still isolated. CREST is particularly looking at new generation of devices, so they are looking at things like femtocells or fifth generation tablets, new sources, and it's a bit of complementary to Geronimo, to the one that I showed just before. So things like voice over IP, LTE, virtual reality, smart devices, virtual reality is whatever I said before, where you have a different type of way of holding your device. And with that, I've reached the last slide.
Thank you very much.